The Things We All Carry is a podcast about first responders and their stories surrounding trauma on the job. The intention of this podcast is to raise awareness and share meaningful conversation around a subject often viewed as taboo or simply ignored. Be aware this content may be graphic and it is real. It may not be suitable for children or adults triggered by this subject.
Welcome back to another episode of Things We All Carry. I'm not gonna take too long on this introduction, and selfishly, I have very selfish reasons for it. I'm trying to watch some Olympics, kind of enjoying the performances by the athletes we're seeing, and I kind of want to savor it a little bit. And you only have a few days left, so we get back in and watch the rest of the coverage for the day. It's interesting. I love watching these people compete, the men and women compete, because man, they train for years for this moment. And it's very reminiscent of what we do as first responders and firefighters. You know, we train for days on end, years, months, whatever it is. We train and we get these moments to shine. And we need to be ready, and we need to be ready mentally and physically and emotionally. Without that readiness, we're not going to do the job that we train to do. I mean, to be honest with you, without that readiness, we're not going to be able to train to do the job, let alone to do the job. You know, had a couple of conversations over the last few days, reactions to the episode with Matt Zeman talking about psychedelics, and it's all been positive. And matter of fact, one of the comments was, we all need to get over our dare indoctrination and accept that these drugs are medicine, and just because they're not quote unquote legal in every state doesn't mean they're not good. And there's a piece of politics to that, obviously, and we talk about that in the episode with Matt Zeman. There's a huge piece of politics, because there's a cycle. The laws are written, research is conducted, but the writings are tailored towards the law, because we're trying to keep the legal medicine to the forefront. So big pharma makes money, representatives and senators make money off of big pharma, and it's a circle, it's a cycle, and it's unhealthy for Americans. It's not just a circle and a cycle with medication. It's the same thing with food and, nutrition and health. There is no money in a cure. And that's the issue. Some of these things we talked about, some of these medicines we talked about with the episode in psychedelics are cures almost. And big pharma will lose their money if we cure ourselves. Just like big pharma will lose their money if we start eating right and start working out and start becoming a healthy society. Not to delve too far into politics, but, we shoved a vaccine down people's throats instead of trying to correct what they're eating or correct how they're taking care of themselves, or to induce exercise, or, personal accountability. And it's a thing that is so lacking in our nation and communities that we need to start pushing it. I read a post from my friend Jason Warren, who does the Mindfulness Medic, and he's been a guest on the show, and I'm looking forward to talking to him again. But he literally lost his job today because he spoke out against providers who are out of shape, and he used the word fat. He lost his job because he used his word fat on social media while at work, and there was no warning, there was no counseling, there was no, hey, let's not do this, not do that. He literally lost his job because he was saying we need to take care of ourselves. Maybe he didn't do it delicately. Okay, whatever. But still, he has the right point. We need to take care of ourselves. If we start taking that personal accountability, and we start taking care of ourselves, and we start working out, and we start, it's psychedelics, therapy, whatever it is, and meditation, we start all these things. Like I said in my last intro, little things lead to bigger things, lead to better things. And we need to get better personally, individually, and as a society. This week's episode today's episode is the second one of the week. because I got some extra work done. I felt like dropping another episode. So this is episode 128 of the Things We All Carry. And today I have Jen. Jen's out of Nebraska. And Jen's a volunteer rescue chief. And she also runs private hospital as a paramedic. One of the things she wanted to come on and talk about was how running as a volunteer in a small town affects you, because you are literally running calls where you know everybody, or you know someone who knows that person, but more than likely you are going to know them. And she has a very personal experience with a couple of deaths in her community, and she has to be involved in it. And it's a special bond, I guess would be the way to say it. There's a special bond with a volunteer in that setting and that rule of a community, that it's a very important position to fill, because without the volunteers, they don't have these services, you know? And so somebody has to do it, but we need to really pay attention to the toll that it takes on volunteers to have to be there for not only their patient's worst day, but their friend's worst day. And they do it repeatedly, or their family's worst day. Because I can tell you stories of volunteers in my area who have worked on a code on their father and been in charge of that call on a loved one. And that's a whole nother layer of emotion, if you ask me. Like I said, this is episode 128 of the Things We All Carry. And it's with Jen from Nebraska, talking about what it's like to be a volunteer in a small town in rural Nebraska. Y'all get outside, get some fresh air, get out there and do something for yourselves.
Hold on. And welcome back to the Things We All Carry. This morning, and it is still, well, no, it's afternoon for me, but it's morning for Jen. I have Jen, and Jen's from Nebraska. She has been in fire and EMS since 2011. She grew up in a law enforcement family, and she's also a full-time paramedic in the hospital setting, as well as the rescue chief for a volunteer fire company. And we have kind of talk about a different subject, and we haven't really touched on it much in my setting. And that's the fact that she is in a small town, and kind of every call she runs is going to be somebody she knows, or the people that her paramedics or her firefighters or her EMTs are running, they know them, and how that affects you. And so I think this will be an interesting conversation. And welcome to the show, Jen. Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Excited to share my story with you and give a little insight into small town volunteer fire and rescue departments. I haven't heard a whole lot of that on your show, so I'm excited to
Well, I
share
know
that.
when you first reached out to me, you sent me an email to my story at Things We All Carry, email, and you said you gave me a hard time about volunteers. If you're willing to have us on or something like that, and I was like, of course I'm willing. I've already had volunteers on. There are highly trained volunteers, and they're highly trained career firefighters, and they're poorly trained career firefighters and poorly trained volunteers. And so in my opinion, this isn't a volunteer versus career field. It's a trained versus shitty or bad provider field, if you ask me, for my opinion. And I never have any problem with volunteers, because I think in many, and if not most communities, volunteers are needed to supplement what career does, or you don't even have career and you have to have volunteer. I think that there becomes a delicate balance in some communities where kind of career and volunteer step on each other's toes, and it becomes a don't piss in my sandbox contest. And that's
Yeah.
unnecessary, because I think it can be avoided with good leadership.
And putting egos
And putting
aside,
egos.
but I know that's really hard for
Yeah,
people.
that's hard for everybody. Yeah. And that doesn't matter if you get paid or not. It's hard to put egos aside. But I think,
And I see that on my volunteer department is, I function as a leader and as a member of the department is I have no ego. I'm there for the patient. I'm there for the call. I don't need to build myself up by putting that t-shirt on and going.
yeah, and I just, it's the leadership. Like you said, you're a rescue chief in your department. And so that helps, because that's a top-down attitude. And
Yeah, for
and
sure.
if you don't get strong leadership who can deal with both sides of that, then you're going to have issues, because
Yeah.
your people are going to feed off of what a leader does.
Oh, absolutely. They absolutely do.
So let me ask you one question before we get started on your story. What's the last song you heard?
Ooh, I'm gonna have to look that up. I was jamming out pretty good to music yesterday, so it looks like it was Popular Monster by Falling in
Okay,
Reverse.
yep, that's one. I think somebody's put it on before. I don't know if I have it on the playlist or not. Wait, did you put it? Did you answer one of my questions with that song on the channel on the Instagram channel?
It might be because it's on my
I
workout
think because
playlist.
somebody did, I believe, and I put that on I think I titled it "The Songs We All Carry" on Spotify. So I think it's there.
Yeah, that could
Yeah.
have been.
Well, that's all right. So I think I know I've heard it because somebody has already suggested it, but it's a good one. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Wyoming, very small, rural Wyoming. My dad was on the sheriff's department out there, and he primarily did homicide investigations. He worked a lot of bodies. And, he was getting tired and sick of that. And in Southwest Wyoming, when I've got three other siblings, when we grew up, there was really nothing left for us out there. We could be a Mormon missionary, go work in the oil patch, the coal mines, the gas fields, or leave. So he really wanted more opportunities for us. And he was just kind of tired of working bodies.
I can understand that. It seems like that would get old pretty quickly.
Yeah. And so growing up, he would pick me up from preschool, kindergarten, half days, and we'd go over to his office. Uh, and I think this is part of why I am the way I am now is to occupy us. We would look at photo albums uh, of
Right.
autopsies of crime scenes, and that's where I learned what a crispy critter is.
That's great bedtime stories.
It's phenomenal. That explains why we always go to the back of a restaurant when we have family dinner because nobody wants to hear our
Right.
conversations.
That would that would disrupt the flow of a restaurant pretty quickly.
Yeah, and, so it's a very unique way to be raised, but it also gives you a very realistic view in life of, not everything is Disney movies, uh, and I think that did attribute to me growing up early. I was always, that super mature kid in school, never did anything wrong, had my act together, never got anything below a B plus. Um, is I was always very much adult compared to just being a kid.
But that forces an early maturity then.
Yeah,
And you
yeah,
do
and
you
that feeds into my struggle of I've always had this struggle of self-worth and finding self-worth and being a good student, doing things for other people, working hard, always doing extra just to prove myself worthy in other people's eyes. But I really suck at being worthy in my own eyes.
There's a lot of us that do that, and not so much and I don't mean so much the people pleasing, it's recognizing and utilizing that self-worth is something that a lot of us don't do. And I
Oh,
think it's a good
absolutely.
reason why a lot of us get into some of these positions is because now we can render aid, give hope and help to other people, but we ignore ourselves. We do.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you end up in Nebraska then? He got tired of bodies.
Uh, yep. And, he was originally born out in the Sandhills in Nebraska, had family over towards the east side, so we moved out to the east side. Um, and he originally was gonna retire completely from law enforcement, ended up getting another law enforcement job, and here we are.
So for people that and most
So
people aren't gonna go, "Oh, the east side of Nebraska. I know exactly what's there. What's the closest city for Omaha?"
Omaha.
Okay. So Little League
Omaha.
World Series kind of thing. Oh, no, College World Series. Excuse me.
College
Yeah,
World
excuse
Series,
me.
yeah. And the world's best zoo.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Sorry. No, but College World Series, that's what I would know Omaha for more than anything, I think.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Other than that, it's
and that's
cornfields.
coming up actually. So how do you end up where you are?
So I, was gonna follow in dad's footsteps, got a degree in law enforcement. Decided after I joined the fire department, because I wanted to help. I wanted to help the community, get a foot in the door of being a first responder. Got my EMT. Found out I really love medicine. Absolutely love medicine. So I have yet to use my criminal justice degree for anything. Um, but finally, well, my now husband was in Iraq contracting, gave me the opportunity to leave my full-time job, which was manufacturing plant EMS. God awful
Yeah.
boring,
So were you
especially
just on
on night
standby for an
shift,
accident?
pretty
Yeah.
much.
And
I did a lot of metal slivers, a lot of bitch stickers on
hmm
paper cuts. Occasionally, we had something like an irrigation pipe fell and landed on a guy's ankle. Um, there's galvanizing over that plant, so sometimes they had a little bit of zinc burn. Um, while I was there was nothing major. They've had others where they had a huge wave of molten zinc come down on a guy, some heavy steel plate, pin a guy against a wall, those sort of things, but nothing that spicy when I was working.
so you decide that's not for you. It's not enough action. It's
It
just
was
not
just
not holding your interest.
it was not challenging me physically or mentally at all. And it paid the bills, that's all it did. So I left, um, started in my paramedic training, got my paramedic, and went right into doing critical care transport, right away, which was an interesting jump after doing 911 BLS, because my volunteer department's just BLS right now, um, to doing critical care transport. It's a whole nother world of EMS and medicine.
Yeah, it is.
And I had a lot of patients that weren't as stable as they should be, going to a tertiary level of care from like your level 4 trauma centers or your critical access hospitals. And I had a lot of patients try to have pancakes with Jesus on me.
Yeah, well, and let's talk about that, but though, because you're in a rural area, and so your
Yeah.
transport times to these various hospitals and centers, they got to be pretty extended transport times.
Yeah. So I worked in the center of the state for a little while with this company, and it was about 4 hours to a level
Yeah.
one.
And so
So when
outside of the most
you have
critical
someone that's
cases, you're
sick,
driving those guys and
oh
gals
yeah,
4
or
hours.
yeah, and if, the helicopter can't fly because of weather or wind, or there's no fixed wing available, you ground
Yeah.
pound them. That's the only way you can get them out of there.
So do you
And
find that to your liking?
I loved the critical aspect of here's my set protocols. My patient goes really hypotensive on me. Um, I can't overload them with fluids because they do have some CHF. What's my next step? Is I can start them on epinephrine. I can do an epi drip, a dirty epi push, uh, Levafed, dopamine. I've got a lot of tools at my disposal, and I get to look at the protocol and look at the patient and decide which is best. I remember one weekend, because I was the main transport provider for 2 hospitals. I ran out of Levafed one weekend because I had to put so many people on pressers.
So what do you do?
You do dirty epi drips. Drop cardiac epi, push it in a 100 mil or a 200 mil bag, and then you just do drips or you just do push dose epi.
So you're talking to a basic. So you're gonna dumb it down for me. I'm following, but I'm just a basic
So,
EMT.
so you can do like the cardiac epi we push in a code. You can draw 1 milliliter of that and put it in a 10 millimeter flush that you push 1 millimeter out of. So you've got a 1 to 100 concentration. And then you just push 1 milliliter of that at a time every 5 to 10 minutes or
Gotcha.
so. Whereas a Levafed drip, you just we create our own kits. So you put 8 milligrams of norepinephrine, which is another pressor, um, into a 250 ml bag, and you put it on a pump.
It's funny because, we're all on these calls, but I was for the majority of my career, I was on a specialty piece, and so I'm really good at the logistics of how to get patients out of houses, and and
Oh,
and I
yeah.
lift heavy things, but that's the extent of patient care on specialty pieces in my community at
Yeah.
least, or in my department. So you're doing the critical care transport, and you're also then in the volunteer system at the same time?
Yep. So I'm still volunteer on my fire department. We have about 30-ish members. About half of those are EMTs, and we have a couple paramedics. But we're still just a BLS squad. And it was during that year as a critical care medic that we had one of our first big losses in our fire department. He was working as a deputy at the time and was watching it. He was FTOing a couple new guys as they were doing an arrest, started having bad pain. He was able to drive himself to the nearest hospital, got his vest off, collapsed. He ended up having an aortic dissection.
And so that's just a freak of nature that happens, correct?
Yeah. And yeah, and he had worked a house fire the night before. Um, and then so he technically fell under line of duty on the fire service as well as the actual death happening during his time as a deputy.
And I think we're going to get to that emotional part, but I think it bears out to be mentioned, this whole thing about he's working as a deputy, but he's also working as a volunteer firefighter, and you quite often you see some of that overlap, from
Oh
fire
yeah.
to police or police to fire, and I can in my own head I can name probably 7 to 10 people I know personally who have done or are doing that,
Mhm.
and so that's a big thing in a smaller community.
Oh yeah. And we've had several deputies on our fire department. The neighboring fire departments, they have several deputies, as well as career guys from the bigger cities. Um, So they live out away from where they work, and they join the fire department to help give back, and they're such a valuable resource. But I can also understand those paid guys that don't want to join or respond to a lot of the calls just because they need that work-life
Oh yeah,
separation to
yeah.
balance, for
So
sure.
this gentleman, he knows something's wrong. He gets in, he drives himself, takes his vest off, and collapses.
Yep, just
And so
dropped.
what happens from
They
there?
they worked him. They worked him as a code, and I was actually heading back, from a transfer, and I heard our chief deputy, go, um, on duty, essentially special assignment. I'm like, "It's 4 in the morning, that's really weird." And I was actually gonna call him and say, "Hey, it sucks that both of us are up at this time, what's up?" But I didn't, and I'm kinda glad I didn't not because I knew what he was heading to do. He was heading down to the hospital. But it was a very weird just kind of turn of events of, somebody that appeared fairly healthy and just all of a sudden.
And so the people that worked him were friends, correct?
Yeah. So they all knew him. He was down, at our county, the one hospital we have in the county. So they all knew him.
And so how do they start dealing with that? How does your department or your hospital or the community go, okay, these people need something and we need to process, and how do they do that? What's the first step for you guys?
Uh, what we really did was, after his wife had agreed to doing, the line of duty death, the formal, funeral, which is, he really deserved that, is we got bunting put up at the station. There was always somebody there that was doing casket guard, um, down in, the funeral home, and, we polished all of our trucks, cleaned everything up. We got ready for the funeral. There were about 6 or 7 of our apparatus, in the procession, uh, apparatus from all over. the county, at least every fire department in the county had at least one rig there for the funeral. And then there were, of course, it was law enforcement. So there was law enforcement from all over the state, was there as well, including the piper from Pipes and Drums out of Omaha. They came out. Just it was just a great show of support.
But more specifically though, how do they handle the people that worked them? Like, are there
Um,
services
I
immediately
don't.
provided or is there or do they even have something set
No,
up for that?
they there is CISM, critical incident stress management, stress debriefings. I don't know if the hospital had any support there. That's not the hospital that I currently work
Gotcha.
at. Um, but there was nothing on our department set up as far as a CIS at debriefing or anything. It was just kind of on your own, and we're slowly changing the outlook of all of the trauma that you take on the job, you internalize it, file it away, and don't deal with it, to, guys, let's talk about this. This was a shitty call. Let's talk about
You
this.
say you're slowly transitioning away. So is this kind of like, I think of this is going to sound kind of silly, I think, but you think of the West Coast, East Coast, and how trends start, and then they come to the center. Correct? Is that
Mhm.
the same thing?
Yeah.
So you're starting to see East Coast, West Coast, and they're starting to accept. Okay, we have to be open about these things. We have to discuss them. We have to, you know, shows like this, shows various different shows, various different programs. The encouragement of talking instead of holding it in. You start to see that more, but are you guys we started to see it maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but now you're just starting to see it, or has it been a couple of years now for you guys?
We're just starting to see it. Omaha, I know Omaha Fire has a big kind of a research program they're getting ready to put in for more mental health support.
Okay.
Um One of my good friends is actually kind of fielding the project, and he's super excited to get it underway. But more support of, when you have a big structure fire, that engine goes out of service so that you guys can clean hose, re-roll it, clean your gear, put fresh gear on, get a decon shower in as priority. And just have a little bit of downtime to take a breather, right? So what they wanna do on the rescue side is, "Hey, we just worked this 18-month-old we pulled out of the hotel pool. We did not obtain ROSC. This is a really shitty call. Let's do a 4-hour out of service. Let's go back to the table and let's sit and talk. Let's debrief this with the crew instead of, if you have a really bad call, they send you home and you don't have any support to deal with it at home."
Now, being a small community, do you guys have the manpower to cover a 4-hour out of service?
Uh I mean, the big paid agencies, like Omaha, Lincoln, Grand Island, they do. The small paid agencies don't. The volunteer side is, um, we're not a huge. We've got a lot of square miles we cover, but we're not incredibly busy. Like, we do 150 squad calls a year,
So in that case
so we don't necessarily
exactly.
do, and a lot of it
In
is
that case, you might not
you.
even need to have a coverage because,
Right,
okay, it might be
right,
another 6 or 7 hours before, or it might be another day before you get another call. And so you're probably
right.
gonna have some downtime to sit and process a little bit. But on the other hand, you
But
also
with
have downtime to sit and ponder it a little.
Yeah. And it's hard with a volunteer group is you have guys during the day that work in town and they
Mhm.
respond. Or I work overnights and so I'm sleeping or around during the day and I go on the call, but when you finish that call, everybody else has to go back to
Right.
work or go back to what they were doing. You really don't have that time built in that you can sit and debrief and actually talk about it. So there is that disconnect of, you go, you run the call, and then you go your separate ways again.
And do you guys maybe just check in on each other just, as friends at that point, or what are you doing?
There's some of us that do. I like to check in with all my guys, say, hey, that was a really hard call, or, we pushed really hard to get this person to where they needed to go. Are you okay? Are you processing it? And there's still the macho ego factor of, yeah, I'm fine. It's fine. Uh, And I always make myself available, be like, hey, that was a really shitty call for me. It's going to take me a little while to be okay
Right.
with it. But if you want to talk about it, I'm here to talk. I'd like to talk with you.
So you get around, either you're going to have some sort of a debriefing, whether it's formal or informal. You guys are trying to do something.
We're trying to do that because we hadn't before. And even before my chief's death, or even from his death, we didn't have a debriefing. And I think that negatively affected our department, is not having that
Well,
debriefing.
you mentioned it. So how long before this next incident happens, between, you lose this gentleman who's the deputy, and then he dies from this. I mean, it's devastating, and unfortunately for him, this is going to happen somewhere along the way, because this is just part of what he was living with, unknown to
Right.
him, unfortunately. But how long before you experience another death in your department?
It was about, hold on, a paramedic has to do math. Let me get my abacus. Um, it was about 3.5 months.
So not a big gap,
No.
especially when you're talking about.
So just enough for us to kind of start getting our new normal, with one long-term member that's been gone. He was on our department for, gosh, just about 20 years.
So set the stage for this next incident.
Oh, all right. I might just read what I have written out, but I might ad lib
All right,
too.
go for it.
So I was at the last hour or so of my 72-hour shift as a critical care transport medic. Um, I was actually pretty lucky because I got to sleep about half the night. And it was about 8 in the morning, and the tones dropped for a 65-year-old female, difficulty breathing at my own fuel. That was my chief's fuel company in town. And as a side note, I've got full permission to say all of the details of this story, just so there's no um, HIPAA
Yeah,
Nazis out
nobody's gonna
there.
hit us up with the HIPAA violations.
Um, and so that was the fuel station my fire chief owned. I woke up, and the first words out of my mouth were, "God damn it, Banky." I'm like, okay, so it's his bookkeeper having chest pain.
Mhm.
I was just kind of looking forward to sleeping. So I threw on some clothes and grabbed my glasses and a hair tie, and I run out the door. I pulled up, because our fire station is just catty corner to his fuel
Gotcha.
station. And I jump out, and our squad is just pulling up to his truck. And I'm like, oh God, it's Rob. And I jump out. My truck is still running. And his two best friends was the assistant chief and the fire captain. They were just pulling him out of his truck and laying him on the ground. And I looked, and I realized who it was. At that point, I just shut my emotion brain off, and I just went into work mode. One thing that I've just been able to do, probably because I am neurospicy, is I can just shut my emotion brain off and just use my logic brain and do what needs to be done. Um, So we threw him on the cot. We got him in the back of the squad. Um, and I can still see, their faces, the panic, the horror, the fear, the anguish in their voices. I immediately jumping back, and um, our assistant chief was driving, and then the fire captain jumps in back with me, and then one of Rob's fuel employees was one of our firefighters, and he was on scene and jumped in back too. Um, and he's our captain's doing compressions, and he goes, "Lucas?" I'm like, "Yep, Lucas, I'll grab the airway. I want you to get him on the monitor." The driver jumps in and starts driving, and it's 2 turns to get back on the straight road that goes to our highway. And the driver took those turns so sharp, I got tossed into the cabinets and bruised some ribs. Um, but I go and I just, I drop a King Airway in and I look at his eyes and I just knew. I didn't have to look at the monitor. You just see where the soul has left the eyes. Um, and that's a vision that still stays with me. Um, so we get the rest of the monitor hookup. I put end title on, and I see an end title of 10 as I'm bagging him. I've got good breath sounds. I've got a good waveform with my end title, but it's 10.
Yeah.
So I know he had a pretty significant downtime, and he's asystole on the monitor. Um, we are just a BLS squad, and so we requested ALS from the town next door where the hospital is. We get just into the south side of town, and they jump in with us, get an IO, start doing epi. Once we got into the hospital, we're running into the trauma bay, and that deputy's widow is a nurse at the hospital, and she was sitting at the corner of the desk right next to the trauma bay. And Chris tells her, "It's Rob." And just the horror on her face, the tears as she jumps up and runs into the room with us. Um, we move him over. We still have the Lucas on. Doc pauses and he puts the ultrasound probe on and he looks for any contractility, any movement of his heart, and there's none. So he goes ahead and calls time of death. Um, and after that is just kind of when my emotion brain kicked in. Um, and that's kind of when I just started crying and I felt all those feelings. Um, and in a town of less than 800, everybody knew him. He was the Gladys Kravitz, and he knew everything about everybody as well. And he knew every resource
Yeah.
available.
Yeah, that's huge in
And
itself.
yeah. And it was the hardest call I've ever ran, but my greatest honor.
Everybody's working this guy knows him and knows him very well.
Yep. Yep. His employee, his 2 best friends, the guys that jumped in for ALS knew him as well.
And
Um,
so
I mean, he'd been on the fire department since he was turned 18, and he had just over 40 years on the fire department.
Hey guys, quick break right here just to check in and thank each of you for listening to the show. Your support has been paramount, and I appreciate all of you. I have one request, though. I need you to share the show with everyone you know. Help me get the word out and spread these stories as far and as wide as we can. While you're at it, please leave a review of the show wherever you happen to listen. Feel free to reach out to me at any time to share your story, to talk, or to pass on suggestions. Let's get on with the rest of the show.
And you said it before we even talked about it, that nothing had been implemented since the last time you lost somebody, which was 3.5 months ago, which is a short time,
Right.
obviously. You can't really fault them, but they have to, at that point, be thinking about, was there even a consideration, okay, this might happen again, and how do we handle it?
I'm not sure there was. There's still just that kind of stigma of the mental health, and you just handle things on your own, and only when it becomes a problem because you're getting drunk every night does it need to be addressed. And it's been a hard thing to try and turn around, and we're still in the process of doing that. Is like every bad call we have, I'm checking in with members. I'm trying to push that, have an incident stress debriefing with somebody that we can trust to talk to.
Are members open to it or resistant to it?
There's some that are open to it and some that are resistant. The struggle is some of the other leaders are resistant to it. Oh. And it's hard to encourage that it's a positive thing.
It is, especially, and I think we mentioned at the beginning, if your leadership is espousing one set of beliefs, and you're kind of on the other side trying to preach a different approach, you've got a battle, and not to
Oh,
over
absolutely.
dramatize it, but you've got to battle good and evil kind of, where you've got it's the angel and the devil on the shoulder, right? And
Yeah. And
who's going to win out is up to
it's
a
cha-
very personal decision on how you want to handle going through grief or trauma.
and it's that's not the way things have been done for 40
Oh yeah,
years.
that's
The
not the way we do
the
it.
way things have always been
Yeah,
done. That that's one of the biggest battles in any department is, changing those things. Even something as simple as going from an EpiPen to drawing up epi out of a vial and doing a shot in the
right.
arm. Change is hard.
Change is hard, and people hate it. But again, what's the adage? They hate how everything is as well.
Yeah. And it was it was a long morning in the ER. I mean my truck was still parked halfway in the street running,
Yeah,
and I had called a couple people that I know in Cedar and I'm like, "Hey, could you shut my truck off for me?"
yeah. Maybe move it out of the road, that kind of thing.
Um and we went through kind of the calling tree and notified all of our members to contact captain and lieutenant to let so that we could, spread the
Yeah,
news, notify the department. I texted my dad and he happened to be on vacation. Um, and I told him I just coded Rob and he didn't make it. Um, I then texted my HR lady and my clinical coordinator from my full-time job, because I was going to let them know that I need days off for the funeral at the very
yeah.
least.
Of course.
Um, just give them a heads up. And, um, the following night, I met with my clinical team from work because they were in town doing trainings. And I sat and talked with them. And that was probably one of the biggest things that helped me was talking about it to people I trust, um, that come from um, the medical background, the law enforcement background, and that talking about it made a huge difference with people that I
Right.
trusted. Instead of just filing it back and not dealing with it. So, as a department, what I saw was, we didn't get together, we didn't debrief over that call, but everybody just jumped in and started doing tasks, just movement, something productive as the way they were dealing with grief. Um, and that was just kind of centered around the fire department, putting up bunting again, cleaning and polishing trucks, mopping the floors down. I mean, the deputy's gear rack was still shrouded in the black bunting. Um, and actually, Rob's are today, to this day, a year and a half
Yeah, I was
later.
just about to ask exactly how long ago this was. So 18 months ago, this happened.
Yeah.
And
Aw.
all right, so that begs the question. You've now had 18 months. You've had 21 months since between the deputy dying, Rob dying, you had 3 months. Now you have 18 months. So 21 months since you had that first one that you're talking about. Okay, now we're going on 2 years. What's changed now? Has anything changed?
Um, I mean, it was a huge change losing somebody that was such a staple on the department. Being chief, I mean, he still showed up for every 3 a.m. rescue
Mhm.
call, usually in pajama pants. The SpongeBob were my favorite. um, we always gave him crap for that. our assistant chief stepped in as acting chief and just kind of took over those leadership responsibilities. Mhm.
But before you go further with that, those are all the kind of logistical changes that have to be made
Right.
when you lose somebody that is in that position. I wanna know, is somebody saying, "No, we have to change this. We have to institute this kind of a response for a trauma the for the people that have to experience this, that are on the other end, not the person that died, because that's obviously a tragedy, but there are people here that are
Mhm.
going through hell because of what they had to do to try and keep this guy alive." Has anyone
Mhm.
made any kind of move to institute change there?
As far as creating like stress debriefing, a protocol for running a hard call of coming back,
Yeah,
like grab some food, grab a soda, sit down and
yeah,
chat. Not really, which is hard because we're still trying to push the boulder out of the way of this is the way it's always been done. Put your feelings aside. You're a man, you don't need to feel those feelings. Just put those bad memories back in a filing cabinet, never bring them up again. And it's such a challenge, especially for me as a female, in a leadership position, to say, guys, it's okay to feel feelings. It's okay to talk about a hard call. I know you guys have 20 years of hard calls.
right.
Um, I watched one of our members have flashbacks of, um, a patient that came out as like a SIDS that um, it had ended up being homicide. And that was never dealt with. There was never a stress debriefing for that. And that was a few years before I joined. Um, but just encouraging mental health is a challenge because the way and most small town people in Nebraska address their mental health is they go to the
Right.
bar. You know, they go and hang out. It becomes, very shut down. You don't deal with feelings. You just don't.
Yeah, and that's a Midwest mentality that's kind of probably still
Yeah.
entrenched, and it's gonna be very hard to get out of that, and so, you as a leader in this department, how what do you see as your role in trying to make a change there? And do you think you can make that change incrementally, by doing kind of almost guerrilla type warfare on it? Because that's what I mean, essentially, in
So,
while you still have
oh,
while
it
you still
is.
have opposition to it, you're going to have to do it in that manner, right?
You do. It's just like you just slowly chip away, and hopefully that boulder becomes small enough you can push it out of
Mhm.
the way and have that opening. Um, and there's having that kind of disconnect of a volunteer department is we meet once a month for meeting and truck checks, and then we have a fire training, we have an EMS training, but everybody else is so spread out that you may not see them until you're on the next
Right.
call. But trying to get people together to say, hey, tonight at 8 o'clock, we're just going to sit up at the station and chat for a little bit. The few people that do want to see that change and have that support will show up. Some of the people that need that support, don't wanna open themselves up and be vulnerable, won't show up.
Right. Yeah, and you can't force them to show up, can't force them to talk about their feelings. You can offer a service, you can offer a conversation, you can offer whatever you want. You're right, you can't force somebody to do it. But at some point, you kinda hope, and I don't know how you start to reverse that thought process. I mean, it's happening on a wider basis, so, I would imagine that there's hope out there for these people, because they're gonna have to
Mhm.
do some of it, or um, they're gonna live with a bunch of shit for the rest of their lives. I
Yeah,
mean, even people that are
and
talking
I
about it are living with shit for the rest of their lives.
and growing up, you know, my I've got a really close family. My dad is one of my best friends, but he's one of those that um, he puts everything back in a filing cabinet and you just don't deal with it. Like, you can start addressing these bad things. You don't have to wake up with nightmares and visions of the bodies you've worked for 20 years. You can open those files up, let your mind process them so they go back into the memory bin and don't keep recurring.
Well, what are you doing for yourself? What are you doing with those
Uh,
images, with those experiences, with his death, with Rob's death? What are you doing for yourself then?
I mean, we've got some resources through the First Responders Foundation. There's a couple mental health therapists that have come out to our department. And before Rob died, I brought them out for training of mental health of the responder and mental health crisis
Mhm.
response that I've utilized. Another one is just talking with the people I trust. My sister, she's an ER nurse. She gets the medical side of it. The clinical coordinators from my last job that I chatted with the night after Rob died. Just I'm putting myself out there and talking about my traumas so that other people see that it's okay. And I mean, even my husband doesn't quite see all of my traumas. Um, and he was back from Iraq at this time. Um, and so he was around, but he wasn't the most emotionally available for me, even though he tried. For him it's hard to know what to do to help somebody that is grieving like that.
It can be, yes.
And it is for him. I mean, he's a grumpy biker. And so that was hard for him too, and it was hard for me just because he didn't wide understand everything that you go through when you're working one of your own people. The judgment and I have terrible imposter syndrome. And I'm always second guessing myself, but as on a lot of volunteer departments, if you're a paramedic, I mean, you're kind of put up on a pedestal by EMTs and EMRs that you can do so much more. And I wasn't able to save Rob.
Well, how long was he down before somebody called?
Yeah. I mean, we were able to look at the village cameras and see that it was between 15 minutes and a half hour that we knew from the last time we saw him, which he was getting into his truck, to when his employee found him lumped over in
Yeah,
his truck.
unfortunately.
And so I knew that was a significant
Right.
downtime. I looked at the pupils, they were fixed and dilated. His end tidal was 10. He was a systole on the monitor. Logic brain tells me that, I mean, he had already reached clinical death. Emotion brain was, you didn't save Rob.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
Um,
that's what your emotion says to you, and then you have to think back, well, what did I do? And if you can honestly answer that I did everything to the best of my ability in my training, then you did what you're supposed to do.
yeah. But it struck it struck a big challenge with me of just, did I why wasn't I able to save him? You do everything you can, but as a paramedic, you're put up on this pedestal of you can do so much more, and there's really not a whole lot more I could have done. And just that again sense of ability. Um,
You know, the funny part is I don't mean funny. The ironic part is the fact that you're sitting there as a paramedic and you're saying, with this training, I should be able to do this, right? And
right.
at the base of a CPR or what we call a stoppage in the department I worked in is the fact that it is a BLS call with some ALS attributes added in. And
Oh,
so
definitely. And CPR is one of the most BLS calls you can run, because what matters most is all BLS
Right.
skill.
And so, yeah, that's what, and so you could also turn that around and say, well, if BLS had done the job, well, it's not though, because you know that he was down for X amount of time. And so in your
Mhm.
logic brain should also tell you, yeah, there's not much we were going to be able to do at that. But you did, in reiterating to yourself that you did your job, you did it the way you're supposed to do it. You covered your bases and you gave the care that you're supposed to give. That was what's the
Right,
important part.
right. And I mean, there were, in any grieving process, the stages of grief, there's the
Mhm.
blaming. And I mean, we saw Rob on the camera. He had walked over from his fuel station, and we know he always puts the trash can out, checks the ice machine at the station, voicemails. And then we saw him walking back over, and you could tell that his gait was ataxic.
Mhm.
It was more lateral steps, the stride was short and stilted, so we knew something was wrong. Huh. But and with, the 15 to 30 minutes of downtime, you're not gonna you're not gonna have a rusk
No,
unless they're very
yeah,
cold. And maybe protective hypothermia helps out,
maybe.
maybe.
So
But,
that's a whole nother
um,
thing to talk about.
uh I've always had just this big dose of imposter syndrome. And not being able to save Rob kind of jumped in there. I mean, my logic brain
Mhm.
knew right away. But I don't know if I was gaslighting myself, or I was just very receptive to the body language from other people, but I felt like there was a little bit of blame on me as the paramedic on that run that I didn't save Rob.
Blame from whom?
Uh, from the other guys on the department, from myself. Um,
You think
Again, I look at body language way too deeply
uh,
in people.
I was gonna say, if you think if you sat down with them and said, "Hey, do you guys think I was at fault?" Do you think they're actually thinking that?
I know they would all say no, and I don't think they
Okay,
were
that I was gonna
thinking
say
it,
that wasn't the
but
question. Th So, no, because I don't think anybody believes that.
no.
Nobody looks at a paramedic unless you physically do something that causes a death. No one's gonna look at you and go, "You failed because you didn't you what you" no one's gonna say you killed somebody unless you actually physically pushed the wrong meds or you did the wrong thing at the wrong time.
Or just, on a code, you don't start
Exactly.
compressions. Something grossly
Right.
negligent, but, that's, changing outlooks of, as a paramedic on a department that hasn't had many active, competent paramedics, you're just as limited as they are with the equipment and the skills in
Yeah,
back.
and you're not a superhero.
I am not a superhero.
Whether we all like to think we are or not, we're not superheroes. All we are is trained human beings.
Yeah. And it really made me step back and consider whether or not I was gonna continue in EMS and medicine.
So why
It
so what
it
obviously you made the decision to stay.
I did. It took just talking to people, um, my friends that are in EMS, um, friends online that are in EMS that, I could chat with, that I trust. Just, I was still a baby medic, at that time. I consider anything less than 5 years a baby medic, and I'm still in the baby medic stage. But whether or not I was good enough to keep doing this, um, and it took a lot of just that introspective review of why I'm here, what I'm doing, and looking back on everything that I've done right. Like, hey, I did this intervention on this patient and it turned their care
Right.
around. Just looking and starting to make up for, one negative of, this patient went really downhill on me, you know, Rob wasn't a Ross, of these are the things that you've done right and you can do this job. And it's, fighting that self-worth, that imposter syndrome. Um, that's still, that's still a big issue for me today as I'm working through that.
I think the dirty little secret is that in this business, a lot of people are going through the imposter syndrome themselves, but they never want to say anything to people.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
so I think that if you could get people to answer questions truthfully, the majority of them will go, "Oh, I'm just winging it. I don't know anything. I'm just getting lucky when I do this." And it's not. We all dedicate time and energy to training and practicing a craft. And we're not imposters. We're fallible and we're human beings, but we're not imposters.
And definitely, if anybody asks me, how do you think you're doing as a paramedic? I'll tell them, well, I'm not the worst
Yeah.
paramedic.
Well, we're our own worst critics all the time.
Oh, absolutely.
So how do you work on that? How do you start to gain the confidence and gain the certainty that you know what you're doing? There are going to be those moments where you go, "Oh shit, I've never seen this before." But there are also going to be the moments where you go, "I got this. I see this, I see that, and I know what to do." And you're gonna walk away. You're gonna find a balance, right? So how are you going to give yourself that grace to learn and to continue on?
By literally telling myself, hey, you can do this. You have that negative self-talk that kind of just spins through your head. And I catch myself listening to that and being my own worst critic. And I go, if you wouldn't say that to somebody else, why are you saying it to yourself?
Yeah.
And say, okay, here's something negative you're feeling about yourself. Find 3 positives. It's just finding those positives and saying, you did this right. You did this right. And it's just doing that on repeat. It's so hard to undo all of the self-criticism that you've just kinda lived with for years. And it's like, again, chipping away at a boulder so you can move it.
So you're the rescue chief in your department, and you can form some sort of change. You
Yeah.
can. The fact of the matter is you can. You're in a position where you can start to form some kind of change. In a perfect world for you, how do you want to see this kind of a safety net set up for your people when because they are going to experience death of people they know again.
Oh,
So
yeah. That's
so
inevitable.
how would you like to see that played out in the future? Ideally.
And I would like to set up where we have, 2 or 3, maybe not senior guys on the department, and I use the term guys
Yeah, we all
loosely.
do.
I could call them all fuckers, but it's not the most appropriate, but it is
Right.
gender neutral. Um, I'd like to set up where, 3 or 4 of us that are trusted people are willing to trust us and communicate with us, and just if we're not on that call, we see it come up on our call log and see who responded and check in with them and say, "Hey, you guys, let's meet up, Tuesday or Thursday, you guys pick which one at 8 o'clock at night, we'll sit around, um, have a pop and a snack, or a beer if that's your thing, and we're just gonna sit and chat about this call. You know, how do you think it went? Ease into feelings, what was done, and not focus on so much of the coulda, woulda,
Mm.
shouldas, but encourage open communication, and especially, since I'm a pretty open person, and say, "Hey, I really struggled with this. I'm finding it hard to work through. This is one thing I'm doing that I can work through this is I'll go and lift heavy things in the gym, because movement helps your mind process things. As a predator, as a prey animal, one thing that you do is you process feelings and emotion and pent up emotion with movement. Um, my away from public service hobby is horses. And I've learned over the years of processing emotion, processing trauma. Let's say something scares them or something has them on edge, is getting them to move, um, and getting them focused on their feet helps them keep that little trauma from building up to where they
Right.
blow up. Just creating movement, creating purpose helps your body process all of those traumas. Um, I mean, one of the books that gets mentioned all over your podcast all the time is The Body Keeps
Yep.
the Score. And I don't know how many times I've bought that book off of Amazon and mailed it to
Right.
people or given it to people and be like, "Hey, skim through it, read it, look at it." But if you don't want to sit here and listen to me talk or share with me traumas, I'm just gonna put the ball in your court. When do you want to address this?
Yeah. And that's a valid way of doing it.
Just offer those resources for them to be able to take up when they're ready.
So where are you at with all of this today?
Um, I, there's not a spot in town that doesn't remind me of Rob or the fire department or the calls I've ran, just because it's a
Mhm.
small town. And you can either see those as triggers or you can start to see the positive memories. Um, I mean, it took 3 or 4 days for Rob's truck to get moved from where he had it
Yeah.
parked. Um, and that was technically a trigger. You see that and you're like, you can just see, the 2 guys pulling Rob out of the truck, putting him down on the ground, running up to that scene. You can look at that corner, and go, Rob was there. An intersection where Rob almost hit me I don't know how many times as we were both heading to calls. You can take your foot off the brake and look and be like, "Oh, I'm not getting hit this
Yeah.
time." You see the fuel trucks and you expect the big wave with his hand, um, and you can smile, and every time you see that fuel truck, you can remember Rob's big wave. Is you just processing through the trauma, through the grief, and seeing more of the good memories. And then, like, one thing that really encouraged me was I'd look back on the calls at like 2, 3 in the morning. Rob would jump in back, and Rob was an EMT, but he never called himself a confident
Mhm.
EMT. And especially anything having to do with babies or women or that stuff. He would, I remember one time I had the sim truck. I was training officer for a few years, and I had the simulation truck come up to do childbirth and OB emergencies. He wanted to avoid that so bad, he scheduled a colonoscopy for the next day.
That's a bit drastic.
And, you look at all those fun things, but when I would jump in back with Rob, he would always say he's so relieved to see me back there. He's like, "Oh, thank God you're back here." I'm like, "Well, he trusted me to do good patient care and to be a good
Mhm.
responder." And even at the gravesite, we were walking through as a department, giving his wife and his daughter hugs and words and everything. And, Audra said to me, "Rob would have been so glad that you were there for him." You just got to keep telling yourself the positives of, hey, you can do
Right.
this. You're a good responder. You've done these things correct. You have it in you. You don't suck as a person.
Yeah, so it
And
goes back
it's,
to that kicking that imposter syndrome to the curb a little bit,
it does.
improving that self-talk. And listen, we can all improve self-talk because when you said something about the self-talk, I thought to myself, "Oh, you mean normal everyday conversation in my head?" Yeah, we all do that, right?
Right?
And it's not
Right?
right, we immediately beat ourselves up and then "Oh, you're such an idiot." And I was like, "What? No, you wouldn't say that to anybody else." Well, I might, but it would be extenuating circumstances. But normally in normal conversation, you would not say that to other people. So why are we saying it to ourselves? And I remind myself all the time not to do it, but I still do it. And so it's something that we all
Oh,
need to
yeah.
work on.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, this afternoon, I go in and have my annual eval with my boss. And I walk in, she's going to say, "How are you doing?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't suck at my job." It's hard for me to talk myself up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, unless you're egocentric, and we all are to a point, but that's what you're focused on, it is hard to talk yourself up.
I've started to put myself out there on my Insta, doing some TikToks with that, is just to put more positives out
Mhm.
there and to put a little bit more of myself out there. And I think it's helped me with my negative self-talk because there's people there that are cheering
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah, and except for maybe, the lone asshole every once in a while, most people are gonna be pretty positive about things. So, that's the thing people don't
Right.
realize.
Right. And anywhere I go, I try to build other people up, like the people I work with, the guys I'm on calls with. uh, I try to build them up and give them compliments
Mhm.
because I know how it feels to be shit on and to say, "You did that wrong," and have that judgmental stare and be like, "Hey, you initiated this. That's awesome."
Yeah, that's a different way of approaching it, and it's a very good way of approaching it, "Hey, you at least took initiative to do this. Let's let's focus on that, and let's work from there."
Yeah. And mostly, I just want to be the leader that I needed years ago.
So, on that note, and I think that's perfect, let's talk about those 2 last questions I have.
Ooh,
And
okay.
you know it's coming, and you kind of had a little bit of time to think about it, not really because we've been talking for over an hour. But what about a moment of awe? When's the last time you experienced a moment of awe that you kind of sit back and you just like, huh, Jesus, fuck, that's amazing. And I think this is a tough question because we don't lend ourselves to it very often. We don't take, first of all, we don't take time to observe enough. And then we take for credit or we take for granted, excuse me, a number of things that are actually, no, awe-inspiring.
Hmm. I think the last moment of awe, um, ooh, that's a tough one, Stack. Um, I think my last moment of awe, um, was a few weeks ago. I was out riding my horse, and we just went into this really nice, soft, beautiful
Mhm.
canter, and you just feel that teamwork between the rider and the horse, and it just makes one perfect energy. And that's one thing that you don't get to experience super often,
Okay.
uh, and especially with my horse because he doesn't have that kind of work ethic all the time. Um, but just that moment of zen.
I think that qualifies as a moment of awe.
Yeah. And I've always been a huge believer in a canter is the cure for all evils.
Okay. I
And it's just one of those moments. And with horses, you have to live in that
right.
moment because as a prey animal, they don't live in the past. They don't think about the future. They're just existing in that moment. And when you're working with them, you have to do the same. And it makes them very powerful creatures for being able to help the human shut their past off and just live in the current, in the now.
Hence why we have equine therapy.
I did that. I worked with a program for 19
There
years
you
doing
go.
that.
What about a book? Give me a book recommendation so the audience has something to
Oh,
look forward to or look into.
let's see. Any of the Harry Potter
Okay.
books.
A little escapism, huh?
Absolutely.
Little note. I've never read a word of Harry Potter, so
Oh, you're missing out,
yeah,
man.
maybe not.
I mean, I love reading history, medical. I'm not super like the sci-fi or the romance stuff, but I love me some Harry
All right,
Potter just because it's just that little bit of escapism,
makes sense.
and it creates just that comfort feeling, the feeling of known, and
So, how many times have you read through
just
them?
finding a book. Several times I've read through them, and I listen to them all the time.
So, there's something to be said about that because there's some research that shows that people who have experienced traumas and who have not necessarily your own traumas, but like a first responder or who's been in those situations will turn to a familiar thing like we'll watch the same sitcom over and over because you're comfortable in it because you know the ending and there's not a surprise and it doesn't bring out anxiety from watching it or listening to it because it's not new and you're not trying to figure out what's going to happen. And so there's interesting research out there to back that.
Oh, I absolutely
Yeah.
believe it.
So, well, listen, thank you very much for this conversation.
You bet.
Um,
Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to join the podcast. And hopefully it reaches a good group of people. We keep growing the podcast because I love listening to them every new episode and watching what you're trying to do.
Thanks for listening to another episode of The Things We All Carry. Head over to the website, thethingsweallcarry.com for show notes, resources, and to sign up for the newsletter. Until next week, take care of yourselves and remember to check in on each other.